lawyer, legislator, and business executive, Senator Lee brings a practical perspective to the criminal and juvenile justice reform movement. He will discuss the impacts of overcriminalization and mass incarceration on individuals, families, and communities. Then he will describe the opportunities and challenges of implementing restorative justice as an alternative approach. Having passed 5 bills, creating a legislative framework in Colorado, Senator Lee will discuss the stakeholder engagement to overcome resistance to change and the Colorado experience with restorative justice. Please join me in welcoming Senator Lee.
After meeting with the young man serving life without parole for killing a 3-year-old baby in a drive-by shooting, Charlotta Evans said, "I got all of my questions answered. I am completely satisfied. Now I can think about Kayson's life. Before, all I could think about for 25 years was Kayson's death. Raymond promised me he would never use his hands for violence again." Bryce Brozier, an offender in the Department of Corrections, after meeting with his murder victim's mother, said, "I never put myself in the victim's place, and hearing what she was forced to deal with made me feel and instantly face the issues of my selfish behavior. It was uneasy, but the lasting impression of it made me want to live my life as a better person." And then from a mom whose son was killed in a drunk driving accident after meeting with the driver, her son's best friend, I came away finally with some feeling of completion, understanding, relief, and peace, like a huge boulder had been lifted from my heart. When I read these statements from offenders and victims of the most horrible crimes, I ask, why hasn't restorative justice moved from the margins to the mainstream? When I read that we incarcerate more people in the United States than any other country in the world, with 5% of the world's population in the United States, we incarcerate almost a quarter of all the prisoners in the world. Why do we continue to replicate this failed model? Why don't we adopt restorative justice as the first consideration for responding to offenses? When I attend victim-offender dialogues and observe the transformative impact, the deep insights, and the existential changes that occur, not just for victims and offenders, but for community members and for the facilitators. When I see offenders accept full responsibility for their actions, and I witness, often for the first time, the emergence of empathy in offenders, when I see repairing of broken relationships with families, victims, and communities, I ask again, why hasn't restorative justice always been available when offenders accept responsibility for their offenses? When I learn that our prisons are now the default options for substance abuse people and the mentally ill, and that disproportionate minority incarceration is devastating our communities of color, I ask, why don't we adopt restorative justice in all of our communities? Before I was a Colorado state representative and a senator, I was a businessman, a practicing lawyer, and a community volunteer for almost 40 years in Colorado Springs. Part of my law practice was representing indigent defendants who I was appointed to represent by the local judges. And during my years of working with these criminal defendants, I saw some who learned from their mistakes paid their price to society, made changes, and went on to live productive lives. That would be the goal. But more often, I saw most who did not. They were angry. They were angry at the prosecutor. They were angry at the court. They were angry at the system. They were angry at the victim. And they were angry at me. Many of them refused to look in the mirror. I know from decades of personal experience working in the criminal justice system that it's operated by some of the brightest, most hardworking, conscientious, and diligent people in our communities. They sincerely care. They give of themselves beyond measure, their resources, their time, and they're fervently committed to making the system operate with humanity and justice. But despite all of this, it became clear to me that the system was not working. Not many people think of Albert Einstein and Niccolo Machiavelli in the same context, but in our analysis of restorative justice and the criminal justice system, the alternative approach, both are apropos. Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. We need to see the world anew. The problem is crime and public safety. Our solution in response has been incarceration. When imprisonment doesn't solve the problem, our response from the same consciousness is to get tougher on crime, do more, harder, better. We double down. We build more and bigger prisons. We implement mass incarceration. We eliminate judicial discretion. We impose mandatory minimum sentences. We enact 3 strike rules. We legislate even longer prison terms, followed by parole with onerous conditions which normal people can't adhere to, and people fail and they go right back to prison. It is not news to this audience that these policies have caused the United States to be the incarceration nation. As I told you, we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. The average incarceration rate in the world is 160. 160 people per 100,000. The United States rate, 700. Kansas is about 322, so you just incarcerate twice as many people in Kansas as other countries in the world. My home state of Colorado, we incarcerate 3 times as many people. By comparison, remember the United States rate is 700, the world rate is around 160, Greece, 111, Germany, 78, England, these are Western economic and social peers of the United States. Japan, 45, England, 140, France, 104, Canada, 114, China, not a liberal democracy with easy laws, 118, Libya, 99, we're at 700. Virginia Senator Jim Webb, when looking at these numbers, said, we are either, in the United States, the most evil people in the world, or there's something fundamentally wrong with our criminal justice system, and I, said Senator Webb, prefer to believe the latter. The futility of mass incarceration is self-evident. It is ineffective at rehabilitation. It, in fact, exacerbates criminality. It fails to reduce recidivism, and it is unconscionably expensive. As you no doubt are aware, 97% of inmates are released from the Department of Corrections. Only a very few are kept on life sentences. But while incarcerated, we don't give them treatment for drug and alcohol abuse or mental health conditions. We don't teach them job skills. We offer too few cognitive, behavioral, educational, or re-entry skills, and as a result, we release inmates back into our community who are unrepentant, unrehabilitated, and unprepared to return to our communities. As a result, we have unacceptably high recidivism rates. Kansas reports almost half of their releasees from prison return within 5 years. Nationally, the rate is closer to 60%. Colorado's on par with Kansas, we're at about 50%. When people get out of prison, we don't give them identification cards, we don't give them money, we don't give them medications, we don't give them housing or jobs. In fact, the collateral consequences of prison are that they are disabled from getting housing or jobs. We prohibit jobs to people who come out of prison. As if these numbers were not sufficiently appalling, the issue has significant racial implications. I urge you to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, describing the impact of conscious and unconscious racism, of over-policing, and the war on drugs in communities of color. More African Americans are under the control of the criminal justice system, said Professor Alexander, in prison for probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850. 1 out of every 7 African Americans is under some form of court sanctions. I could go on, but you can research those numbers. Meantime, we keep feeding the system. In our schools, we adopt zero-tolerance policies, leading far too often to suspensions and expulsions. We know that kids who are suspended and expelled drop out. We know this. This is not hypothesis or guesswork. We know that kids who are suspended and expelled are on a fast track to drop out. In many states, fully 1/3 of our high school students quit before graduation. Less than 50% of some students in communities of color graduate. In a practice replicated across the nation, after the Columbine shootings in Colorado, we criminalized what used to be school offenses, and we sent 100,000 kids in Colorado to the criminal justice system for offenses for which I would have been sent to the principal's office. We rely too heavily on punishment rather than rehabilitation or restoration. As a result, our future as an educated nation is at risk. Our costs for incarceration are escalating and unsustainable. In the United States, we spend more on prisons and jails than on educating children. Every state in the United States spends more on incarceration than on education. The growth in correctional spending exceeds the growth in educational spending in all but 2 states. And now, 15 states spend at least $27,000 more a year on incarceration per inmate than on education. Over 30 years, Kansas's spending on incarceration exceeded spending on education by, ready, 250%. According to for you research wonks, Department of Education report, U.S. Department of Education Policy and Program Study Service, July 2016. So I come to this discussion from a businessman's perspective. Years ago, I attended the Wharton Business School. After that, I worked for 2 Fortune 500 companies. I can assure you, in the business world, if we had a 50% product failure rate, we would change our business model. Having worked in both the criminal justice system and in the schools, I'm on the board of a charter school in Colorado, I've seen all of this firsthand. I became convinced that we need to try something different. We need to break the cycling and recycling of people. We need to move from suspensions and expulsions, feeding the school-to-prison pipeline, to different restorative school cultures. We need to move from punishment, from vengeance, from hatred and retribution in our criminal justice systems to responsibility, to collaboration, to repair, and to restoration. We need to try something different. Restorative justice is something different, and we know that it works. Restorative justice focuses on accepting responsibility and repairing the harm to victims and the community. It looks at criminal offenses as a breach of the relationship between an individual and the victim. Remember social contract from Rousseau? It's a breach of the relationship between the offender and the community. Restorative justice gives offenders the opportunity to repair those relationships by meeting face to face with their victims. With one-on-one conferences guided by a facilitator, offenders can hear firsthand how their acts impacted the victim and hear it directly from the victim. Victims can learn firsthand the answers to those questions they never get answered in the criminal justice system. Why did you do it? And they can hear that directly from the offender. I've participated individually in scores, maybe hundreds of these victim offender conferences over the years. And I can tell you from experience, for most offenders, virtually all of them, the experience is transformative. Offenders change because they develop empathy. They see their victims as sentient human beings, and they walk in the shoes of their victims. They sit in a circle right across from their victims, and they look them in the eye, and they talk with them. They become accountable for their actions, and they accept responsibility for what they did. And they're given a chance to repair the harm they have done, both to the victim and to the community, to make amends. Victims and offenders both report significantly high levels of satisfaction with the fairness of the process. I've seen restorative justice circles, I've seen offenders in restorative justice circles get up after hearing from the victim, walk across the room, stick out their hand, and say, "I'm sorry." Doesn't happen in the courtroom. On some rare occasions, I've seen victims stand up, look the offender in the eye, and say, "I forgive you." Again, you don't see that in the criminal justice system. The power of restorative justice is illustrated by a story, so bear with me. In the summer of 1986, in the South African ghetto of Guguletu, Mangazi Mangini was participating in the riots opposing the government policies of apartheid. Amidst the confusion of the riots, he saw the white face of Amy Beals, a California Fulbright scholar who was studying in South Africa. She'd been working there for the last year. According to his own testimony, Mangini confessed, "I tripped her. She fell down. I got a knife from a friend and I stabbed her. I know it was my wound that killed her." He was sentenced to prison for the rest of his life. 8 years later, during the extraordinary and unprecedented tribunals conducted by what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Mangini applied for amnesty. Amy Beals' parents came to South Africa, met with Mangini's mother in her home in the Black Township. She read a letter from Amy Beals written before the riots in which she expressed her admiration for Nelson Mandela, and it said, "Though the policies of apartheid have devastated the country, the creation of community will be just as difficult, but it is the only path. After meeting with Mangini and his mother and listening to their stories, sharing their mutual anguish over losing their children, witnessing Mangini's public statement of responsibility and remorse, and hearing that apology, Mr. and Mrs. Beals supported Mangini's application for amnesty. Today, Amy Beals' mother and Mangazy Mangini are working together in a foundation in South Africa to build community. So what took place in the hearts and souls of Amy Beals' parents to move them to forgive their daughter's killer? What expansion of consciousness promoted this profound transformation from the initial feelings of anger, hatred, and a desire for retribution? What occurred is what we seek in this process we call restorative justice. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the most notable example of restorative justice. Following the collapse of apartheid, those who enforced it, some of whom had never been exposed, as well as those who opposed it, like Mangini, with violence, many of whom had already been convicted, came to the commission hoping for pardons in exchange for truth. Many came seeking redemption. All came seeking healing and restoration. The conventional system was ill-equipped to handle the brutality of societal racism in South Africa, but under the guidance of Bishop Desmond Tutu, who later won a Nobel Prize for his efforts, they adopted restorative justice, in which offenders made full confessions publicly and asked for pardons. The process succeeded for Amy Beals' parents, for Mangazy Mangini, for his family, and for 7,000 other applicants for amnesty. Bishop Tutu captured the essence of restorative justice when he said, "To survive the future, we need to forgive the past." So why does restorative justice work? We've heard a lot of talk about restorative practices, restorative circles, and the process goes on. I've given a lot of thought to this because I've seen it work, and I've worked in the criminal justice system, and I've seen the dysfunctionality of that system. I believe restorative justice works because it addresses what I believe to be the shortcomings in the criminal justice system. First, restorative justice treats offenders with respect. It recognizes that offenders are not bad people. Actually, we don't even call them offenders. We call them people who have committed offenses. I apologize for using the shorthand. It recognizes they are not people, but people who have committed bad acts, and it separates them from their bad acts and treats them with respect. In our conventional system, we humiliate people. We dress them in orange suits. We identify them by a number rather than a name. We send them off to remote locations, far distant from their communities and their families. A wise man said that the way you send a man away is the way he will return. Is it any wonder that offenders return to our communities with anger, resentment, and no sense of belonging to the community to which they are returning? Second, restorative justice puts victims in the center of the process. This is far different from our conventional system that makes victims peripheral. Third, restorative justice does not rely on punishment to change behavior. Punishment and fear can alter behavior temporarily. All of us have done that on occasion, but it is not lifelong, nor is it transformative. Finally, restorative justice is consistent with the basic principles of human nature. It's what sociologist Abraham Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs, described as that fundamental thing called belongingness. Food, shelter, housing, clothing, fundamental needs that we all have, but restorative justice recognizes belongingness at the center of the process, the innate need to belong to a community. Restorative justice recognizes that we live in an interdependent and a social world, a community, and that most of us want to belong to that community. So we start out belonging to our families, our schools, our sports teams, our churches, and for some, gangs. In each of these communities, we expect and we get support and safety. And we give them back in equal measure. When we are thinking clearly, we don't hurt our family members or members of our community because we know them and because we feel empathy for them. Restorative justice proceeds from the premises that we seek to belong, and restorative justice succeeds because of that. It recognizes restorative justice victim-offender dialogues are grounded in that inherent need for community and operates consistent with it. So the question becomes, how do we move from a retributive and punitive system to a restorative and reparative one? I come back to Niccolo Machiavelli. To change the fundamental order of things is difficult, dangerous, and unlikely of success. Restorative justice, make no mistake about it, is a change to the fundamental order of things, moving from crime and punishment, from incarceration and retribution, to responsibility, to repair and healing, requires looking at crime through a different lens. It requires overcoming the inevitable resistance to change, to doing things differently than they have been done in the past. It requires visionary, risk-taking prosecutors who operate at the gateway to the system, well-trained facilitators, and community partners as implementers. And I would suggest courageous legislators who are willing to try something different. And of course, supported funders at all levels. Critically, it requires implementation with adherence to the fundamental principles of restorative justice: relationships, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. We have begun this process in Colorado. We now have a comprehensive and robust legal framework for restorative justice, resulting from 5 bills that I sponsored, but mainly from the tireless advocacy of restorative justice practitioners, victim advocates, volunteers, program directors, criminal justice professionals, administrators, trainers, and community organizations across the state. We started out by working with stakeholders and with proposals for juveniles, because everyone stands for the children. But it was never easy, and it was never an unobstructed course. When I came to the Colorado legislature in 2011, it soon became clear to me that very few legislators knew what restorative justice was. I was faced with wrinkled noses and furrowed brows when I told them I was proposing an omnibus restorative justice bill. So I undertook a major educational program, and I set out to talk with all of my colleagues, particularly because of the process, the members of the Judiciary Committee, the first bill the committee would have to go through. I tailored my appeal to what I knew to be predispositions of the legislators I was going to talk to. So one day in 2011, before presenting the bill to the Judiciary Committee, I walked across the chamber while presentations of other bills were going on, and I sat down with my colleague from the Eastern Plains of Colorado, a staunch Republican libertarian who was a skeptic of anything that the government did. I asked him, what would you think of a system that allows people to resolve their differences on their own without government involvement? I described how restorative justice empowered victims and offenders to meet face-to-face to work out a plan by themselves on cases referred by the courts to them. I explained that private facilitators would help the parties to have a respectful dialogue and create their own individualized resolution. He looked back at me and said, "Pete, you've got me." He not only voted for the bill, he lobbied his colleagues, and he supported amendments that were added to the bill. So then and now, when promoting restorative justice, I talk to legislators from their perspective, not my perspective. To the fiscal conservatives, I talk about cost savings. To the moral conservatives, I emphasize individual responsibility and accountability. I talk about redemption. To the victim advocates, I talk about respect and the beginning of healing. To the progressives, I talk about creating community and repairing relationships. To the law and order set, I talk about enhanced public safety, reduced recidivism, and restitution. The beauty of restorative justice is it has something for everyone. It is transpartisan. So that first bill, House Bill 11-1032, offered as a rookie legislator in the minority party, passed the House and the Senate unanimously. Over the next 8 years, we continued to get bipartisan support as we embedded restorative justice into the fabric of our system. A key was to provide multiple entry points to use restorative justice. At the beginning of a case, via diversion, at plea negotiations, it's in the statute. They can talk about restorative justice diversion. At the advisement, when the judge stands in front of or when the offender stands in front of the judge is telling him what his rights are: right to counsel, right to call witnesses. Your sentence may involve restorative justice. My thinking was, some parent in the back of the court would say, "Judge, what the heck's that? What are we talking about?" And that would provoke conversation and discussion. So as many places, I went through the code, as many places as I could put those terms, restorative justice, in, I put them in. So at advisements, at sentencing, at probation, restorative justice is an option during probation and parole. So we now have an extensive legislative framework for restorative justice in Colorado. And let me tell you some of the components of it. Most importantly, we have a statewide restorative justice coordinating council. And that was in one of the early bills, probably the first bill. It contains all stakeholders in the criminal and juvenile justice systems and the education systems. The State Restorative Justice Council, you can find their website, is really the hub of all of the spokes of restorative justice in Colorado. It provides information, it provides training, and funding emanates from the council. We passed a bill 4 years later which put a $10 fee on every criminal case in the state of Colorado to go into the State Restorative Justice Fund. Every criminal non-traffic case. And it started out creating $750,000. Right now it's about $1.1 million. We use that money to fund restorative justice programs all over the state and to gather data. And right now it is funding, I believe, 11 programs The idea is we'll give them a couple $100,000 to start their program with the idea that they have to transition to their own funding, hopefully through local county commissioners. So we have restorative justice in the adult and the juvenile system, in the Department of Corrections, and in the Division of Youth Services. It's available in schools and charter schools across the state. We have restorative justice available for all levels of crimes, from serious felonies to misdemeanors to municipal offenses and to petty offenses. Restorative justice can be initiated by law enforcement, by victims, by the district attorneys, and by offenders through district attorneys. We've had 11 highly successful victim-offender dialogues in the prisons in Colorado, like the one that Charlotta Evans, who I mentioned at the beginning, participated in. Actually, she went to 2 because her 3-year-old baby was machine gunned by 2 16-year-old young men who went to prison for the rest of their lives. 25 years later, Charlotta wanted to meet them in prison to see what kind of men they were turning out to be. I need a few more than that. That's okay. We have standards of practice for facilitators and for the conduct of high-risk victim dialogues. We have a partnership with the Denver DA's office and the state public defender to train around the state. Significantly, we had a model pilot program around the state. New Zealand model pre-filing diversion with over 1,000 kids who were deferred to restorative justice before charges were filed. 95% of those juveniles, and there were almost 1,000 of them, were successful. Success meaning they went to a victim offender conference, they reached agreement to repair the harm, and they fulfilled all of the terms of the agreement for which their charges were dismissed. 95% success rate. 3 years later, the recidivism rate was under 10%. The normal juvenile recidivism rate is around 30%. You can calculate the savings. So ladies and gentlemen, we've made great progress in Colorado and we're on a good path, but we have multiple challenges. One of those challenges can be addressed and remedied by you in this room. To move restorative justice from the margins to the mainstream, we need it to be in the forefront of the consciousness of judges and lawyers as they engage in their daily practice. Restorative justice needs to be part of the curriculum and taught in every class in law schools across the country. The principles of restorative justice and their application to civil and criminal cases is critical to furthering conflict resolution. Other challenges and myths that we need to dispel. Some critics condemn restorative justice as easy or soft on crime or an easy way out. To the contrary, anyone who has had to face their victim face to face will tell you it is one of the hardest things they have ever had to do. Look up the documentary Meeting with a Killer. Gary Brown, who was facing an execution date after a tense and emotional meeting, answering the tough and probing questions from Linda White, the mother of his victim, said, "Turn to the camera, dying is easier than this." Second, restorative justice is proposed only for juveniles or low-level crimes. It can, has been, and should be used for serious felonies, including homicide cases, to benefit victims and families. The more grievous the harm, the greater the possibility for meaningful repair and restoration. For Charlotta Evans, meeting with the young men serving life without parole was a life-changing event. She would say that meeting and forgiving Raymond Johnson and Paul Littlejohn liberated her from her grief and gave her a purpose in life. She travels the country initiating programs to end life without parole for for juveniles. It has become her life work. C.S. Lewis said, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending." Restorative justice empowers crime survivors to change their ending. So third, restorative justice is not being proposed as the sole and exclusive response to crime. It can and should be used in addition and in combination, in many cases, with prison. It is not anti-penal or anti-punishment, though the central focus of restorative justice is repairing the harm. Punishment can be an instrumentality for restoration, especially for offenders who accept their sanction as a means of atonement and for gaining reacceptance by their community. Finally, restorative justice is not for everyone. A prerequisite for participation in restorative justice is acceptance of responsibility, and if people are not willing to accept it, they are inappropriate. So in Colorado, we have a statutory pre-conferencing or pre-screening of all offenders prior to participation, and statutorily they have to accept responsibility, be contrite, and be willing to do something tangible to repair the harm. If they don't meet those criteria in the views of the facilitator, they don't participate, they go into the standard system. I can assure you that most people are accountable. Sociopaths, probably not. Some child predators, maybe not. Most people are. So the potential for restorative justice is virtually unlimited. As we work to expand the use of restorative justice for serious crimes and we move it from the margins to the mainstream, our vision for restorative justice needs to expand to its use in genocide, gross violations of human rights, the repairing and redressing of temporary injustices such as Ferguson, Cleveland, Staten Island, historical injustices such as slavery. Why can't restorative justice and reparative circles be used for environmental and toxic spills such as Love Canal, Exxon Valdez, Three Mile Island, or the Gold King Mine along the Animas River in Colorado? How about for resolution of claims by indigenous peoples? Why not use it for sex assault? I was preempted. Individually, systemically, like with the U.S. gymnastics and taekwondo teams. Of course it can. Whenever I become complacent or daunted by the enormity of the work we have to do, the words of Margaret Mead inspire me. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful people, thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Restorative justice can change the fundamental order of things. It could be a game changer. It could transform our criminal justice system from one of incarceration and retribution to one of responsibility, reparation, from one of punishment to reconciliation and healing. It could end the school-to-prison pipeline, which is decimating our communities of color. It could break the cycle of crime and close the revolving door of prisons. It could lower prison budgets so we can spend more on classrooms than cages and more on textbooks than prison blocks. But we face enormous challenges to move restorative justice to the mainstream. So it's important to remember the courts, the criminal justice system, and the schools belong to us, the people. And when they are not working, we must insist upon change. We, the people, must insist that restorative justice be used. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors who are victims of crime to request restorative justice. Tell the victims to tell the district attorneys that they want to meet with their offenders to participate in setting the consequences. Restorative justice empowers victims to begin healing. far too long. Victims have been peripheral. They need to be at the center. It is now their right to be there. Tell the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the judges, and the magistrates that you want them to use restorative justice because it works. It reduces reoffending. It promotes decarceration. It lowers costs, and it promotes reconciliation. So tell the legislators you want them to pass restorative justice laws so offenders can be held fully accountable to repair the harm done to victims. In the schools, tell the teachers, the principals, the administrators, the school board members to use restorative justice in schools to end the cycle of suspension and referrals to law enforcement. Use it because restorative justice keeps kids in schools, facilitates learning, changes school cultures, and gets parents involved. Restorative justice needs to be the first option to deal with offenses in schools and communities. So now is the time. We, the people, need to insist that restorative justice be implemented fully, robustly, with fidelity and completely. If you're thinking that these indomitable challenges to change the fundamental order of things can only occur when hell freezes over, remember, it snowed last December in Las Vegas and last week in Los Angeles. I promised Cheryl Wilson that I would announce that the National Restorative Justice Conference, National Association of Community Restorative Justice, is being held June 14th this year in Denver, Colorado at the Sheraton. We're expecting 1,600 people, an extraordinary panel of speakers from all levels of knowledge about restorative justice. So that's the next place to go. Thank you, leaders of KU Law School, for organizing this. We may look back and say this is where the change began. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee, for your comments. So we are going to do a few questions in exchange for a shorter break.
Yes, Senator. You know, what percentage of your adults convicted of crimes go through restorative justice programs, and what effect has it had on your adult recidivism rates?
I don't, the question was what percentage of adult offenders go through restorative justice and what effect has it had on recidivism, reoffending, is that what you're getting at? Yeah, I can't give you that number offhand. It's nowhere near as much as we would like it to be. We've got a lot to overcome. It's more in isolated cases. We're doing more and more of it with juveniles. We've filed about 5,000 juvenile cases a year in Colorado. We just passed a major reform bill at the center of which is diversion, particularly for low-level offenders, into restorative justice. So we're thinking that in the juvenile world, we'll have a 70–80% referral into diversion for restorative justice processes. So on adults, we've got a lot of work to do there.
As someone who has to face voters periodically, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you have thought about or maybe dealt with a charge from an opponent, you know, sort of a soft on crime. Anytime anyone tries to do meaningful criminal justice reform, that's the risk, right? So I'm sure you've contemplated that. How do you deal with your constituency to try to inoculate them to that kind of campaign? And then if you have to face it, what's your elevator pitch to voters to try to defuse that?
Okay, good question. How do I address the soft on crime, tough on crime continuum? Well, one thing, if you ask people, is crime going up or down, and you ask, any general group of people, and they'll say they think it's going up. In fact, crime's going down. There's less crime now. The height of the crime wave was in the 90s when we began this mania for incarceration. And right now, I don't have the numbers at the top of my head. I do during campaign season. But crime's actually going down. Prison budgets are going up. Charges and filings are about even. And people being sent to prison is increasing. So I talked to them about costs. I talked to them with the business pitch about how ineffective prison is. If the communities were becoming safer because we're putting more people in prison, that might be an appealing argument. But in fact, we put more people in prison. The more people we put in prison, the more come out and commit more crime. So decarceration is the model. I live in Colorado Springs, which is a Republican, conservative, evangelical, libertarian community, and they've elected me a Democrat 5 times. I'm not radical on either side. I explain the rationale for things like restorative justice. It works, it's effective, and it is cheap. What's to lose? Cheryl.
I'm just gonna.
The national president of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. You should stand up because you're one of my.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate very much what you shared. I just wanted to make a brief pitch that if you are interested in the conference, I have cards for our executive director, Michael Gilbert, who can handle anything regarding questions or registration or anything like that, and it's got the information for our website. I do encourage you to come simply because it will give you the biggest taste of what is happening across the country in the field. And then for statewide type of work that's been happening, I am the director of the Kansas Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. We held the first statewide conference on restorative justice last year and had about 100 or so folks. And some of those people who organized that are in this very room. We want to grow this as much as possible. So you'll see us show up when we see that this is what's happening. We want to support and we want to educate and we want to show you where the resources are. So thank you. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you.
You've marshaled the arguments for this very well. Are they in printed form, or have you written an article where we can all borrow from?
The arguments to present?
The arguments that you've made today. You certainly make the case for restorative justice, and none of us like to reinvent the wheel. We'd like to steal your remarks.
Right. I'll make them available to the conference planners. They can have that speech, and you can distribute it however you want to distribute it.
Jackson will be on the symposium editor. My information's online. Feel free to email me.
And I claim no proprietary interest in any of this. I mean, you can quote me, use it, defame it if you want to. It's all available. Machiavelli owns his, and I plagiarize him as well.
Can I ask one more question? Just curious about, we met earlier, you mentioned that Longmont established at the local level the kind of framework that made the state possible. Could you say a little bit about what local players could do to pioneer restorative justice?
Sure. Well, restorative justice is inherently a community-centered option. Longmont started with people who were zealous advocates for restorative justice and got together a group of stakeholders the way any community organization works. And they brought in law enforcement, they brought in defense lawyers, they brought in judges, they brought in police and sheriffs, and they brought in all of the people who were concerned about the future of community, and they brought in experts who could explain how restorative justice works, and then they founded the Longmont Community Justice Partnership, and it's a community-based organization, but there's a lot of different models. Some restorative justice programs are run out of police and sheriff's office, some of them are community-based, some of them are faith-based. They run in all sorts of different varieties, but what we find is that restorative justice is typically catalyzed by champions, and when champions get it going, they bring in other people, and the challenge is sustainability, and Longmont was diffused their work out throughout their community, and other communities are doing the same thing. So that's pretty much how they did it. But you have to keep it active and keep people involved. We've had restorative justice program in various schools where we have a principal who's very excited about it, and then he leaves and the new administration has diminished enthusiasm and the program sort of withers. So it takes, constant prodding and flourishing and cultivating and fertilizing and funding to keep it going. But I sell it based on results. And the decarceration model that I've been working on in Colorado to reduce the number of people going to jails and prisons, I can argue that with anyone. And who's on my team? Is the Koch brothers and Newt Gingrich. They all got together at the White House and they said, we need to give people a second chance. We need to reduce the number of people in prison. And, the left and the right are coming together because what's been happening hasn't been working. So that's the best argument for restorative justice. And the arguments about the Maslow, it's consistent with the desire of people to be in communities and work in communities and belong to communities. That's all I know.
Before we leave to take another short break, I'd like to note that Senator Lee has a article in our next symposium issue. So if you'd like to look at more about what he is proposing, take a look at our issue. And with that, please allow us to thank you again.